On today's Locked On Jayhawks, we're going to preview the Kansas Indiana game. Should be quite a doozy on Saturday between two top 15 opponents.
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I'm Derek Johnson. Thanks for making Locked On Jayhawks your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get any of your podcasts. You can subscribe to us on YouTube as well. Give us a 5-star rating if you could, if you're listening to the audio format. You can also hear me as well on Rock Chalk Sports Talk Monday through Friday from 3 to 6 on KLWN in Lawrence. And on today's edition of Locked On Jayhawks, we preview the big game coming at you on Saturday, which you can hear on KLWN, your flagship station in Lawrence, for all your KU action. Top 15 showdown between Kansas and Indiana. Indiana ranked 14th. Kansas is, I don't even know, 8th or 9th. I usually look at KenPom more than I look at the AP poll. Nonetheless, we're going to get into the matchup. What about Indiana, matchups of the game, and then we'll finish off with our BetOnline segment of the week. This episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. Kansas taking on Indiana. It's a team that pretty much a top 15 team. Like I said, they're 14th in the AP poll. I think at time of recording, they're 16th on KenPom right now. So very good team. Obviously, a team who should be an NCAA tournament team is going to be a contender in the Big Ten. I mean, obviously, they have to deal with like Purdue at the top. Illinois is really good. But nonetheless, this is a team who is going to have the ability to make a deep run once we get to the NCAA tournament. They're just kind of solid at both offense and defense. They're top 25 in both regards in KenPom's adjusted offense and defensive efficiency. So just a very balanced team. They kind of do everything well. Mike Woodson, their head coach, took over last year, did a good job. They had a team that made the NCAA tournament. They won their play-in game in the first 4, and then they got crushed by St. Mary's in the first round. Brought a lot of players back, most notably Trayce Jackson-Davis. And then they added Jackson Hood-Schifino, who's been a really talented young guard for them. And they've had a lot of talent and kind of meshed well so far this season. They've lost 2 games in the early going, but I believe both games they were without Hood-Schifino, that really outstanding guard. That's one key to the game on Saturday, his availability. I mean, he's a very talented youngster. Bill Self said at his media avail earlier this week that he's one of the most talented, or has been one of the best freshmen so far of the season. He might play, he might not. If he does, that certainly impacts things for how well Indiana can play and how good they are. If he doesn't, that is obviously a huge boon to Kansas. They are a team that is kind of similar to what Kansas do. That was something that Bill Self kind of echoed this week at his weekly press conference, that they do a lot of things schematically or in terms of what their goals are, what their identity tries to be with running or with getting in transition defensively, different schematic things that the two teams are very similar. And I think we said this last week for the Missouri game. That was different schematically in what they did, but Missouri wanted to run up and down. And if you're saying, hey, we're going to be fine running up and down with a team in Kansas that does well at running up and down, and Kansas has the better athletes and the better players, that probably isn't a great recipe for Missouri. So I guess on one hand, you could say, well, Kansas has really good players, and if you're going to play the same way as them, I probably like Kansas there. But this one is different than that, because you can convince yourself that if you're going to play the same style, Indiana comes out on top. And the reason why is they have the stud big man down low with Trayce Jackson-Davis. Now, we'll get into more of that with the matchups of the game, but that's certainly the key for Kansas, not letting Trayce Jackson-Davis have a knockout game where he just takes over completely. He's going to get he's going to score his points, he's going to get his rebounds, he's going to have an impact on both sides of the ball. Avoid the game where he goes for 28 points, 15 rebounds, and just absolutely takes over, right? They play fast offensively. They're top 50 in the country in pace offensively. But if you just look at their overall pace, they don't rank that high up. And the reason why is because they have played at one of the slowest paces on the defensive side in the country. Now, you can't really control pace when you're on the defensive side. I mean, I guess you sort of can. Like, if you're Syracuse, for instance, you play a 2-3 zone. A lot of times your defensive pace is going to be a lot slower than other teams because teams have to be more methodical about working into the zone and trying to find those good shots. So there's certain ways that you can kind of slow things down with the defensive side of the ball. That could just be, the happenstance of who they've played so far this season. It could be because Indiana has played really good defense on the beginnings of actions and the beginning of shot clocks, and so it's taken teams longer to get off open shots. Right, they're working toward the end of the shot clock because they still haven't found a good look so far. As far as the happenstance of just playing a bunch of teams who play slow, they have played a bunch of teams who play slow, but they've also played some teams who play very fast, like in Arizona just last week. So I don't know if it would be kind of a combination of those two things, but another thing it could be is, and I don't know this for sure, but based on that tempo stuff defensively, is that they try to run and get out in transition on offense, but then defensively, maybe they just say, because part of the numbers would back this up, they've not been a great offensive rebounding team. They're not a bad offensive rebounding team. They're just kind of like average at offensive rebounding. That might be by design. Something we talked about with the Wisconsin matchup. Indiana's better offensive rebounding team than Wisconsin was, but the Wisconsin, and this is fact, that they purposely don't send guys at the offensive glass, right? I mean, it might be one guy, maybe two, who go for an offensive rebound, and then everybody else is just backing out to try to prevent a transition bucket so that you have to score on them in the half court because they feel like they're going to be a good half court defense and that maybe they don't have the athletes to line up as well if you're going to play an up and down transition game. So with Indiana, them not being a great offensive rebounding team and the tempo against them on the defense side of the ball being low sort of tells me that they do a good job limiting transition, and maybe they put a design on that, getting guys back so that they do this transition. And keep in mind, Mike Woodson came from the NBA. That has kind of become what the NBA game is. Like, not a lot of teams crash the offensive glass or send numbers forward. So all that would add up to make me believe they put more emphasis on stopping transition. But meanwhile, they're going to try to get out in transition and score on their own. That could be a good or bad thing for Kansas, because if it is an up and down game and they are able to run out on their own because Indiana's playing too fast or they're playing very quickly as well, that's a good thing for Kansas. But the flip side is, stylistically, Indiana might be doing a really good job so far this season in that transition defense. And that would be a bad thing for Kansas, because I still don't really know how great this half court offense is. They executed very well against Missouri, but that's kind of a different animal. And, we know they can be a very good transition offense. The Tennessee game, I think, was a perfect example. Wisconsin, too. I mean, even NC State, you didn't have like the best offensive game, and that was still kind of up and down where you're able to score some points. You haven't been the best half-court offense. It's also been a few weeks. I mean, you've had one game in, 2 weeks, a little over that maybe even. So you've had time to maybe work out some of those kinks, but that certainly is a concern for me in this game. But overall, again, Indiana just a very balanced team. They don't turn the ball over. They shoot it at an insanely high rate from 2-point range, so they get easy shots and they make them. Part of that, Trayce Jackson-Davis down low. They don't take many threes in terms of the volume of it, but they hit them at a very high rate, so they're efficient there. They assist on a lot of their shots. They pass the ball well, and they have a top 15 effective field goal rate in the NCAA. They also have been really good at limiting shooting efficiency to the other team in really both areas from 2 and 3. They get a lot of blocks. They force a decent, but not a huge amount of turnovers. They have been kind of meh, as a rebounding unit, not just the offense side. They've been kind of middle of the pack in the country at defense rebound. So there is a way that Kansas can kind of exploit that and maybe not have as much of a worry of giving up too many offensive rebounds to another good big, which we've seen in other games this season. That's a positive, but overall, this should be quite the matchup between these two teams. All right, in just a second, we're going to get on to our matchups of the game. But first, this episode of Locked On Jayhawks is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for sports betting information, stats, news, and analysis. Get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there, from pro football to college bowl season to basketball and World Cup. They've got it all at BetOnline.net. If you love sports podcasts, you can find those at BetOnline as well. They're the fastest and easiest way to get your betting information. You can head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. We're going to have our BetOnline segment coming up later in the show. We're going to be going over some odds and lines for upcoming KU games and maybe some other interesting stuff around the country. So stick around for that. But you can get it started yourself by just going to betonline.net right now. BetOnline, where the game starts. Maps of the game. First up, KJ Adams / the KU bigs versus Trayce Jackson-Davis. Whoever the big is in for KU is going to have their hands full with Jackson-Davis. He is a legit All-American, averaging over 16 points per game. He's a guy that can get a double-double each and every night. He hasn't taken any threes this season, but he can stretch it a little bit, at least from the mid-range, even though we haven't seen him attempt any threes. And he's so quick. Bill Self said earlier this week his second jump reminds him a little bit of Andrew Wiggins, which that's very high praise for being a guy that, he might miss his first layup and then he goes up and he just catches off the miss and dunks it in. It's a very athletic player, quick. He's a problem for the opposing offense because he's a really good shot blocker, and because of his quickness in terms of being a help defender that he can quickly get over, and also kind of recovering or just being a good, he's 6'9", like 235 pounds. So he's strong in addition to being quick. He is just a stud down low. That'll be difficult for KJ Adams. The biggest part for him is just not letting him have a takeover game, but then also how can you be a scoring threat on the offensive side of the ball? And when it's one of those other centers for KU, you just hope they don't get toasted in a matchup like this. But this also provides an opportunity, right? If you're Ernest Uday, Zuby Ejiofor, Zach Clements, Cam Martin, and you want more playing time, you want to show yourself out, you might only come in for this game for a 4 or 5 minute stretch. I don't know. Maybe even less. You want to earn more playing time? You play well against Trayce Jackson-Davis, boom, you earn it. So an opportunity for motivation and extra opportunity for those players, but it's also a little scary that you have some centers who are maybe a little bit more green and experienced playing a true All-American here. But again, this is a great opportunity for KU to not just show what they can do, but learn from it for later on experiences down the season. So I really like this non-conference matchup that KU is getting to play. It is a much different matchup, though, for KJ Adams. He had the kind of small ball matchup to Missouri. They had a more traditional big, though, with Seton Hall, who actually stretched the floor a bit. But in terms of size, 6'10", 235, I believe, was the Seton Hall big man. And KJ did well in that matchup, too. So this one is a whole nother animal. And if KJ plays well in this game, we're going to be having a real talk on Monday about just how much he has solidified the center position and that, he is the answer. And I don't think there'll be any more conversation about, well, who's the guy that's going to usurp him? But if he struggles, then that conversation is going to come back up, whether that's fair or not. And then there's the other big men too, like Malik Renault. I believe that's how you pronounce it, is their other big man off the bench. They've got a power forward, which we'll get to here in a second. Matchup number 2, guard play. Xavier Johnson, Tamar Bates, Jalen Hood-Schifino combined to average about 28.5 points, 10 rebounds, 11 assists per game combined between those three players. Now, again, with Hood-Schifino, we don't know if he's going to play or not at the time of recording, at least. I don't know. Maybe by the time this comes out, they'll have announced that he is or is not going to play. But you're looking at all those guys. Xavier Johnson is a great creator for the offense. He can create shots for himself. He creates shots for others. He's a athletic, strong point guard. Then with Hood-Schifino, can, again, kind of a lot of the same thing. He can set it up for others. He can create his own shot. Athletic young freshman. Tamar Bates is actually the former Kansas kid. I think he went to Piper and then transferred for his senior year of high school out to, I don't know, one of the IMG academies or one of those big high schools. And he ended up going to Indiana, and he has been like a knockdown shooter this year. He hit a couple big threes in the Arizona game, and he's shooting over 40% from three-point range to start this season. He's been really good off the catch on three-point shots, and really all three of those guys with Johnson, Hood-Schifino, and Bates can create shots. And then you have the gravity of Jackson-Davis in the middle, and if you overhelp, all of a sudden, boom, Tamar Bates is hitting a three. And you think he's going to be revved up to come back home into his home state of Kansas and try to put the, it's not one of those stories of like, oh, Kansas didn't recruit Tamar Bates, and he's just going to be, super angry and have a revenge game. No, like Kansas recruited Tamar Bates. They wanted Tamar Bates, but he just, I don't know, wanted to have something different. He wanted to get out of state, which, some guys, that's the case. But, maybe nobody benefits more from having those guards that can create shots and attach defenders to them and having Jackson-Davis down low than Miller Kopp. I don't know if you'd consider him as a guard. He's kind of more small forward, 6'7". But, for KU, a lot of times they just call their wings guards. So from that standpoint, he kind of is. He's shooting 48% from three on high volume. That'll be tough to deal with all those guys. So don't get overly attentive to maybe if Jackson-Davis has the ball down low and you fall asleep off the ball, and then all of a sudden Tamar Bates is hitting a three or Xavier Johnson is catching it on a cut and finishing in traffic. You have to be good off the ball in this game from the KU guards. Now, on the flip side, you trust DeJuan Harris to put KU in the right spots, and if DeJuan and Kevin McCullough can cause chaos, get some steals, Indiana hasn't turned it over much this season. That'd be a nice boon for you, but not one that I think you can totally rely on or expect coming in. But if you can, and you can make life hard on them from post entries to pressuring the ball to creating double teams, I think they should be okay. As much as I kind of build it as, well, how can KJ Adams do versus Trayce Jackson-Davis? I think it's mostly going to be Trayce Jackson-Davis gets at Kansas double teams. So how do you adjust off the double? Do you rotate strongly? Do you play good enough off-ball defense? Can you get a couple steals off it? That's the real answer to how you can try to make that work. And if they can do that all well, they should be okay. Now, on the flip side, Johnson has been a really good defender too. Xavier Johnson, I think I said on the flip side twice. Doesn't matter. He has been one of the better defenders for Indiana so far this season. By Evan Mia's website, he's been the best. And that'll make things difficult for DeJuan Harris, but that should be a really fun matchup between two really good veteran guards among both sides of the ball. Matchup number 3, the battle of the sharpshooters. I mentioned Miller Kopp, the 6'7" small forward for Indiana, shooting 48% from three on high volume. You have him going one way. You have Gradey Dick going the other way. I don't know if they'll match up on each other. Certainly would make sense that they do because they're both, spot up shooters. Dick, I think, is a little more athletic and does a little bit more than just shoot than Kopp might do. But both guys do have good size that they can impact the game in other ways. But yeah, you look at both teams having a guy who shoots in the mid to high 40% on high volume. And those are guys that can swing any given game on just a run of a stretch where, hey, they hit back-to-back threes in back-to-back possessions. And that can be a difference in what's expected to be a close game. Matchup number 4? Question mark? Yeah, I think number 4. Jalen Wilson versus Race Thompson. So Jalen, obviously the starting 4-man for KU. And honestly, we could have had Jalen Wilson versus Trayce Jackson-Davis in terms of the buildup of 2 All-Americans, 2 National Player of the Year candidates. Earlier this week, we talked about how Jalen was tied second in odds at 10-1. Trayce Jackson-Davis was 4th at 11-1 to win National Player of the Year. And that'll certainly be the storyline, I think, nationally, and what they talk about, like at the pregame of the broadcast, having these 2 stars. I don't know how much they'll be guarding each other because I think it'll mostly be the 5 on Trayce, but you could have some switches where Jalen's on Trayce or Trayce is on Jalen. And for the most part, though, I think Race Thompson will be with Jalen Wilson. So Thompson is an interesting matchup for Jalen because he has been a solid, not elite defender so far, according to Evan Miyakawa's website. He stands 6'8", so has good height, 235 pounds. Jalen's not going to be able to play bully ball if he's guarding him. We've seen a lot of times Jalen's maybe matched up on a 6'6", 6'7" wing, or maybe doesn't have more strength than Jalen. That's going to be tough to kind of play bully ball over Race Thompson at 235 pounds. But maybe, and this is me, I've watched, I don't know, one half of Indiana basketball, one full game maybe, just between maybe like 2 or 3 games that I've just caught different moments of time from Indiana. So I'm by far the furthest thing from an Indiana expert, but at 6'8", 235, I kind of wonder if Jalen's going to have a speed advantage, and maybe he can outquick him. Maybe he can outspeed him because it's going to be tough to outstrength him in the game. And then on the other end, how can Jalen hold up defensively? Thompson's shooting about 55% on 2-point looks this season. The last matchup is the bench battle. Indiana is top 40 in the country in bench minutes played. Kansas is outside the top 300. It makes sense. Kansas hasn't really trusted their bench so far, and guys haven't totally emerged. It doesn't really matter if your starters ball out. Like it doesn't matter how you get across the finish line. Just get across the finish line. For instance, the last game, your 5 starters were more than enough. They scored 86 points against Missouri. If that happens against Indiana, you're fine. But KU certainly has lacked even just 1 or 2 guys. You know what I mean? Like, it's not that Kansas needs to have the deepest bench where they're playing 4, 5, 6 guys a night, but you at least need the 1 or 2 guys you can trust off the bench. Like last year, think about it. Mitch Lightfoot, you could trust to come in off the bench, hit you maybe a couple hook shots, play solid enough for you in the other areas. Remy Martin, you didn't always know what you were going to get from Remy, but you could trust the idea that he could be a star coming off the bench. And then if you had to, it's like, okay, well, I know there's certain deficiencies in the game, but with Jalen Coleman lands, like I know I can trust him to come off the bench and give us a good look at hitting a three, right? So you had certain things that you could trust off the bench. Right now, I think Bill Self trusts Bobby Pettiford at being able to keep the offense in sync when DeJuan Harris is on the bench. I think he's really grown in that trust with Joe Yesufu. Outside of that, there hasn't been a ton of trust established off the bench so far, or knowing that, hey, I'll put this guy in and we're going to do this well, or I can trust this guy to come in off the bench and give us good minutes here. It's just kind of a crapshoot each and every night. And so if you can just get a couple of those, have an impact game from a bench player, they just need some sort of extra punch from one or two guys off the bench. Indiana is going to have it. Will Kansas? That remains to be seen. All right, in just a moment, we are going to get on to our BetOnline segment of the week. But first, this episode of Locked On Jayhawks is brought to you by the NHTSA. You're hanging out with some friends and putting back a few drinks. A few becomes a few too many. As the evening comes to an end and people start to head out, you think of calling for a ride. But nah, you live nearby. You can make it home okay. It's no big deal. What are the odds you'll get pulled over anyway? And even so, what's the worst that could happen? Well, your insurance could go up. You could lose your license. You could lose your job. You could total your car. You could even kill someone. Everyone knows about the risks of drunk driving. The results are tragic and often deadly. However, that still doesn't stop everyone from getting behind the wheel while under the influence. That's why police officers are out there right now looking for impaired drivers on our roads to save lives. So if you think you're okay to drive after a few drinks, think again. Play it safe and plan ahead to get a ride. It only takes one mistake to change your life or someone else's forever. Drive sober or get pulled over. All right, finishing off the show here with our BetOnline segment of the week. How about this as we head into KU bowl season, which right now you can get Kansas at minus 119 odds at +3 on BetOnline. The over-under 69.5. If you want the over, it's minus 108 odds, so a little bit better than the traditional minus 110. You can, if you're in on the Big 12, you can, I like these bets. They have different like conference bets. They have different fun bets for bowl season on BetOnline. Like what will be the most touchdown passes thrown in any of the bowl games? What will be the most total points scored over under this? There's a lot of fun ones that you can just blanket bet on the bowls and just be rooting for like one thing across all of bowl season, which is a phenomenal time of year. You can bet on the Big 12 over under 4 or 5 wins. So basically it's like 4.5 because the under is under 5. The over is over 4. So you need 5 wins or I guess 4 wins, depending if you're taking the over under. If you take the over 4 wins, they would need 5 bowl wins. It would be plus 110. If you're taking under 5 wins, it'd be minus 150. So you have TCU versus Michigan. They're favored to lose. I think it could be a close game. Why not? Kansas State, Alabama, favored to lose, but doesn't that feel like the classic, SEC? We didn't really want to be there, and K-State takes it very seriously, and they're a very good team, and they come out with a win. Trying to think what else. You got like Texas, Washington. That's kind of a toss-up. I don't know. There's a lot of tough matchups for the Big 12 this year, but you can bet on it if you feel confident one way or another with the Big 12 having so many different teams in bowl games. The KU Indiana line is not out at time of recording. I would imagine it'll come out Friday evening, Friday night, Saturday morning range. Right now, if you look on KenPom, it's expected to be 73 to 68. KenPom's usually around in line with what the odds end up being. I would imagine it'll be somewhere between like a 3 to 6 point line for the game, over under in the low 140 range. If the spread is 5 or more, I think I would take Indiana. I'm expecting a very close game between two teams who are similar, and Indiana has the trump card of Trayce Jackson-Davis against some questions about the KU center position, but also KU still has Jalen Wilson and a lot of other really good players. So I just expect a close game. That's why I would take Indiana with the 5 or more. If it was less than that, probably wouldn't touch it. But, if you can get 3 or less, probably lean Kansas. For the over-under, I think I'd be leaning over. Two teams who like to run offensively, even if Indiana does try to cut you off in the transition game. So I'd probably be leaning over there as well. By the way, you can get Kansas plus 225 to win the Big 12 right now in basketball. They're slightly behind Texas, who's the favorite, and Baylor. So that seems like kind of a good value bet right now because never bet against Bill Self to not win the Big 12. All right, that's going to do it for this edition of Locked On Jayhawks. Coming up on Monday's show, we'll recap whatever happens in the KU Indiana game. If you have anything you'd like for the show to talk about or want to follow along on the action, you can reach out at D Johnson Radio on Twitter. And don't forget to subscribe to the show so you're getting all the latest with Locked On Jayhawks. Have a good rest of your day. I'll see some of you on Rock Chalk Sports Talk later today. Bye.